Bienvenidos to this Bienal Biennial. Today we will be having a conversation responding to the question, ¿Cómo viviremos juntos? My name is Luana Ferreira, and I'm an adjunct professor at the School of Education of Hunter College, the City University of New York.
Buenos dias, good morning. I'm Evelyn Fernández-Ketcham, and I'm Executive Director of Workforce Development at Eugenio Maria de Hostos Community College in the South Bronx. And Eugenio Maria de Hostos is of the City University of New York.
Saludos. I am Nelson Santana. I am Assistant Professor and Collection Development Librarian at Bronx Community College, and also producer and editor at S&Dom, Dominican Cultural Magazine.
So the three of us are members of the Dominican Studies Association, an organization that focuses and centers Dominican studies, Dominican research, Dominican scholars in particular, but also topics and themes that relate to the Dominican culture and the Dominican people here in the United States and abroad. And we're going to focus and have a conversation around the question, as stated before, ¿Cómo viviremos juntos? Which responds to the topic of this biennial. So, Evelyn, how do you foresee living together and coexisting together and connecting together as it relates to this biennial, CONEXIÓN, now and in the future? Let's start with a general conversation about ¿Cómo viviremos juntos? Evelyn?
Sí, thank you, Luana. So when I hear ¿Cómo viviremos juntos? It's a very important question for me, and it's one that part of my training is I'm a social worker, and I do believe in the ecosystem and how systems interconnect and the relationship that we as individuals have with systems in the communities that we live in. For me, ¿Cómo viviremos juntos? Is very dear because I am bicultural and bilingual. So, you know, for me, space takes me back to the Dominican Republic, where I spent part of my childhood being acculturated, you know, to the Dominican culture, and then coming back here to the United States and having to deal with that transition and feeling a sense of whether I belonged or not has always been a question for those of us who traveled back and forth. You know, I had the privilege of going every summer.
As we call it, right?
And there were summers that I still have a romance with the Dominican Republic. Every time I went in the summertime as a child, there were like a couple of years that I stayed there and went for the entire year of schooling. So I went back and forth. So which is why I benefit from being bicultural and bilingual because of those experiences. So, you know, for me, the question of ¿Cómo viviremos juntos? Is not just here in New York City. For me, is cutting across the boundaries, you know, and that to me, I belong to the Dominican Republic as well.
When you say bicultural, can you define for the listeners what exactly that means? Because for us as Dominicans, a Dominican is a Dominican is a Dominican. El dominicano es dominicano, no importa donde esté. But there is this construction of identity along biculturalism that many Dominicans are unclear of. So what is it? To me, bicultural might mean que tú eres mitad dominicano y mitad italiano, for example. But you know, you say that you have parents that are Dominican, all of us do. But then can you define what biculturalism means? And Nelson, maybe you can also contribute to that.
Yes,
so
yes.
briefly, what does it mean to be
yes.
bicultural?
And I'll answer and turn it over to Nelson. Yes. So, and thank you for asking, Lana, because it's a real good question, because I feel that, you know, whenever I went to the Dominican Republic, you know, no que tú eres una Dominican York. And that was sensitive for me, because I was like, well, why would you say that? I am as Dominican, and I'm enriched by the culture, you know, and it's striking because then when I'm here in America, in the Western, I'm considered a Dominican. When I went and studied abroad in Europe, I was viewed as an American. I wasn't even viewed as a Dominican or a Latina for that matter. So, you know, for me, you know, bilingual and bicultural means that I have access and I embody, customs from that are not Western
And
lifestyles that have enriched my life and that of my children. Yes, Nelson.
Nelson, ¿cómo viviremos juntos?
Sí, claro, claro. Now, what comes to mind, when asked this question, when listening to this question, I not only consider human beings, family, friends, but also animals, plants, the physical spaces that we occupy, as well as the mental and or invisible spaces as well, for instance, right? And so these are all things that I keep in mind. Now, in terms of the bicultural question, I will not answer it just for the simple fact that I do not like putting labels on things at times, etc. And there are just so many different ways to answer it, and I respect all the different definitions, etc. But with the Cómo viviremos, that's basically what I think about. I think about from the smallest atom and how that fits into the millions and billions and trillions of atoms that are there. And I'll expand more on the other questions, so I'll keep this one short. But how about for you, Luana? What does it mean for you to hear "Cómo viviremos juntos"? What do you think about this question?
There's definitely, for me also, as somebody who was called a Dominican York, there was this conflicting sense of identity where I felt very Dominican. And as a matter of fact, my formative years were in the Dominican Republic. I grew up in Santiago and I went to schools in Santiago, Dominican schools, not even American schools or bilingual schools for that matter. Those were very pricey and prohibitive for my parents. But there was definitely this sense that there was a difference that was underscored by Dominicans. So here I am feeling very Dominican in my Dominican identity, having a sense of my own history, but there's something that made me different from the teenagers growing up in the 80s in Santiago. I'm very happy that that has changed tremendously, but there was certainly this conflicting sense of identity for myself where I felt very much as a New Yorker. As a matter of fact, I still am a New Yorker, pero con mi conocimiento de historia dominicana, mi identidad dominicana, muy arraigada. So to answer the question, I still live in a predominantly Dominican neighborhood, and I choose to do that because I want to be among my own people. There's something to be said about cultural barriers that get dismantled when you're among your own. So for me, ¿cómo viviremos juntos? Estamos viviendo juntos y revueltos y reinventando la cultura, reinventing it through music, through language, through literature, through schooling. So in conclusion, it's being connected and interconnected that is vital to living together.
And Luana, while you're speaking, perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about spaces that you feel like you've been left out of, that you have not felt connected, because you were kind of, I don't know if that's exactly what you were alluding to when you were in the Dominican Republic, if that was that you felt left out, but tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, there's definitely issues about, most importantly, I think it's a class issue among other kinds of issues. But for me in particular, it was definitely a class issue where I didn't have the means to be accepted in certain circles pertaining to the elite. So this is where I found my other Dominican York friends with whom I stay in touch with till this day, where we gravitated toward each other because we had this shared experience of being from New York, spending summers in New York, loving like this New York culture, but also being a minority in New York and being Dominican in New York. So it's this very paradoxical kind of relationship where you're not, and there's a book coming out called Ni de aquí ni de allá. So that was definitely, it impacted my upbringing because as a teenager, those are the years where you are impressionable, I don't care anymore. Like, this is who I am. And si no me quieren aquí, pues entonces no voy. But for a teenager, that makes a long lasting impact when you start becoming exposed to spaces where you don't feel included. The same can be said for New York, where we are still very segregated racially, culturally, and economically. What about you, Nelson?
Yes.
Oh, excellent question. La Biennale di Venezia is about the arts and the culture. So I think it is only fitting that that my response revolve around culture and the arts. And specifically, I'll talk about, poetry, music, writing, and in high school and in college. And so when I was in high school, I had these great professors, great teachers, great educators, uh, Puerto Rican, etc., white. And but there were these two particular white women who had an influence on me, and they were Miss Shear and Miss Bauman. And through them, I wrote poetry, etc. And also translated as a child. Like I came in the '80s as a child, so like many of us here, for example, I went with my parents to take care of legal matters, very important government matters, and I would be the translator for them, for
Or
example.
child translator. Yeah, that
Now
was very
translators,
prevalent
that
in the 80s. Mhm.
that is a big thing. And so in Miss Shear's class, as a class, we actually we wrote poetry, and then we translated each other's poems. And that was just, I felt really included in that space where I shared some of my Dominican culture with these non-Dominicans, talk about el campo, just romanticizing how I miss my country, etc., and all this other stuff. And it was just amazing how I just felt included there, sharing this very intimate part of myself. And during that time, I also participated in citywide and nationwide contests, and even ranked, second, third place, etc. And so it was just an amazing time. Again, high school and college, and I even composed music. I siempre hablaba la cultura dominicana, and so I also, started a band, would sing bachata, merengue, and it was just amazing. I felt so included here, where I could express myself, express my culture, express that love. And if you have Dominican blood in you, it's something that's going to gravitate. Sometimes you see these children that are born in the United States, but they hear the merengue or the bachata and they start dancing, and people are like, wow. Sometimes someone from the Dominican Republic would say, pero ese niño, esa niña baila mejor que yo. For example, because it's something that we have culturally, that we have within us, for example. And speaking of the culture, I also, when I was in college, joined the ACEDOM, the Asociación de Estudiantes Dominicanos, or the Dominican Studies Association, for example. And it was that's why, looking for Dominican culture, finding people that were similar to me, we joined together. We had events where we brought El Prodigio, Querubanda, etc. And it was just a beautiful, beautiful space. As a college student, I wrote, for example, this poem on Las Hermanas Mirabal, for instance. And again, I was encouraged by my Cuban professor at Baruch. But then in high school, going back to high school, there were many instances where I felt excluded. The fact that I was able to rank second, third, received honorable mentions, was in advanced placement classes, English honors classes. I realized, well, look at my privilege. I noticed that I was there, but yet none of my best friends were in any of these classes. None of my best friends were taking, no one was catering to them, asking them to write a play, to write a poem, right? And these were mostly Black and Latinx colleagues of mine. They were, and no one was paying attention to them. And none of my best friends, like closest friends, went to college. And there's a reason why. So at this point, I started to see this thing that I perhaps did not see before. As a college student, I saw the privilege that I had, but also the privilege not afforded to some students, because certain counselors did not take the time to speak to them, right? During this time, stop and frisk. I will be stopped and frisked by the police, right? And touching me in ways that I've never been touched before. So going through that traumatic experience. And then, as I mentioned, the two white educators who were formative in me, I also had another white educator who did the complete opposite. I shared a poem, and she took this poem, brought it to the principal, called my mother, and we had a conference because she interpreted it as me writing a suicide note. So because this was interpreted as a suicide note, I then stopped writing poetry, or at least I stopped sharing my music and my poetry with people. And I did not publish any of that because of that traumatic experience, right? What if I write a poem about abuse or things happening in the world, and then someone interprets it as me committing a crime. So that, these very real, very, very real. So in this space where I was included, again, I also felt excluded, and so much harm was done to me, which at time I didn't understand. But then again, when I was in college, I bumped into this teacher, as me being a college student, I actually bumped into this teacher, into this educator, and I said hi. This was at the Museum of Natural History, and she was with her family, I guess her two babies and her husband, and she completely ignored me. And it was then that I realized, wow, this person was very discriminatory toward me. This person really just didn't support me and wanted to destroy my dreams, for example, right? So I'm gave that example. So these are examples in the arts and culture. Again, to go with La Biennale di Venezia. So yeah.
I wanna go off on something that you said so that Evelyn can answer her question, which is the importance and the role that college counselors play in guiding students that don't necessarily have the access to institutions, to upward mobility. Because Evelyn, I know that you have a very interesting story about how you were in high school and how you ended up studying in one of the most elite institutions in New York City. And I want you to expand upon that.
Thank you, Luana. And so, yeah, the being included or excluded has been a driver for me. I was born and raised in Washington Heights. I went to all of the public schools, except when I was studying in the Dominican Republic. Luana had a similar experience. And at that time, there were no such, you had the English schools, but that was a privilege to go to those schools. I went to straight up Catholic schools, in Santiago, igualmente.
Private, but not pricey,
But not
like
pricey.
the American schools. Yeah,
Exactamente,
yeah.
correcto. Entonces, I went to 143, junior high school 143 on 182nd in Amsterdam, in Washington Heights. And I also went to George Washington High School on 192nd. At that time, considered one of the worst high schools in New York City. However, I was in the College Bound program. So we were a select group that went together. We read the New York Times. We were exposed to college. We went on trips to college. The expectation was that we were going to college. However, we were not necessarily being recruited or going to college like Columbia University, like the yeshiva up the block, Fordham University. I learned about these spaces later on because, in the 80s, if you're growing up in New York City, space and boundaries was a big deal because my boundary was 59th Street. I couldn't go past 59th Street because 42nd Street was so horrible.
Right.
Crime, right?
That's
so
fine. 80s,
yeah, absolutamente. A train to 59th Street. The boundaries were very strict for us growing up in New York City. So, the expectation was like, oh, I was going away to college, and I did. Well, fast forward, I went away to college not too far in Terrytown in Westchester County. For me, that was going away to college. I thought I was far.
Like a foreign country.
Like a foreign country, Luana. And as I grow up, I'm like, I was half hour away from the city. But in mi mente, I was leaving the neighborhood and I was going for another, an educational experience. So fast forward, I made it a point when I came back to my community to apply to Columbia University. Today, I hold a master's degree from Columbia University. Currently, I'm a PhD student at Yeshiva Wertzweiler School of Social Work. And that has been a driver for me because I saw that these spaces, as I was growing up and when I was going up and down those blocks, I didn't have access to those institutions. I could not even dare, none of us as teenagers could even dare to step into any of those spaces. Later on, I came back after college. I also created a nonprofit, New Heights Neighborhood Center in the Armory on 168th Street. My driver was to give young people from the community, Dominicanos, Afro-Americano, Latinos from Washington Heights. And my drive was to help them get a job at Columbia University. Mm-hmm. Gave them access to the Armory. They got jobs at the Armory because these spaces were not open to us from the community. The cloisters should have been my playground growing up in Washington Heights. It's a park in that it's a space that we don't get told. However, there's a whole weekend of medieval history. And only as you get older do you find out about these events. So when I created my nonprofit, I make sure that the young people that were uh, studying with us to go for their high school diploma, an equivalent diploma, we make sure that we took them to the cloisters, to the Jamal Mansion, and help them understand that Washington Heights was rich in culture and that it was their playground, that they needed to understand that because someone had said to them that these spaces, it wasn't belonging to them. People don't know that the high school that I went to, George Washington High School, is the highest point in Washington Heights. And that's a historical site. If you go there, this is where George Washington and
The building is beautiful. The George Washington.
Gorgeous. Do you know that I became part of the yearbook club my senior year because the front doors when I went to George Washington High School were not open, and the beautiful staircases that divide and go up. If you look for my class, we make sure that our picture of our yearbook is that entrance, because to me that was symbolic of the fact that we couldn't go in through the main entrance of the building. These spaces were just closed off for us. And similarly with my children, I've gone back to the Dominican Republic and taken them to La Zona Colonial. I take them to the historical sites in DR that I actually attempt to have access to so that they also get connected to their culture. Because to me, it is important for them to identify Dominican. We're very proud of that. And even though my children are also mixed, they identify usually and typically Dominican first.
So that's very interesting because it touches upon the next question, which is how do we create those spaces so that we can build inclusive environments where we coexist and connect with each other, such as this Biennale that, although it's very art focused, I'm wondering if the spaces get constructed so that people self-segregate. So like you spoke about, I live a block away from the cloisters, and the cloisters have been the playground, my playground. I never felt like this is not mine, but I hear what you're saying, that these spaces are created so that people, one, self-segregate. Ay, eso como que de otro tipo de gente, yo no voy. And these are open spaces. So I think that what you're touching upon, Evelyn, is how do we dismantle those barriers and how do we reinvent those spaces so that we can connect with each other, whether it's via art, via community service, via education. Nelson, how do we dismantle this, or how do we reinvent these spaces so they become more inclusive?
I think that's a fascinating question. That's actually a great question. There are many steps to be taken. First we need to understand our relationship to the world that we live in, the relationship to everything that's around us, that is surrounding us, right? I mean, there are people that take different approaches. There are some people who say, well, we need to decolonize the mind. We need to decolonize these spaces, right? We need to incorporate critical race theory, ethnic studies. We need to become well-versed, learn. And simply, for example, when I was in high school, again, just going back to that particular space, the librarian there, Miss Proman, she asked me certain questions. She found out I'm Dominican. Well, do you know who was the first person to introduce me to Juno Diaz? Miss Proman, my high school librarian. She learned I was Dominican. She gave me, oh, here, you should take a look at this book, Drowned. So it is about learning about each other. It is about understanding our brothers and sisters. It's not just about us. Again, many of us are in these positions of power or positions of privilege, etc., that other people do not. And there are people that have more privilege than we do. So it's really more about communication. We need to communicate. We need to use our ears. We need to use our mouths, and we need to communicate. And I believe once we can understand that and be willing to learn from each other, then we can move forward. And that's just un chin chin, just a little bit of it. But I'm curious to know what you two colleagues, Evelyn and Luana, what you have to say regarding this particular question. Luana, what do you have to say about it?
I think that it starts, I mean, for me, having been what you said, right? Sometimes we depend on others and institutions to have an understanding, to gain knowledge, to gain access. For me, it's about what is the smallest thing that we can do to create access. So going back to the cloisters, and because this is La Biennale de Venezia, the cloisters is a wing, an arm of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, right? And it focuses on, I think it's Byzantine art, medieval art. So this medieval festival that happens every year, it's very language driven in that the promotions are all in English. So that sends a message to our English language learners or people that don't even speak English or recent immigrants that perhaps this event is not for them. So even the linguistic access of it all raises the accessibility of those spaces. So because I have a good relationship with La Hispanic Society right here in Washington Heights, I know the people there. I said, why is medievalism focused primarily on France and England? Like Spain had medievalism. So I helped bring in to the organizers, the Hispanic Society, and there was a booth, an interactive booth, the most successful one, because now we have our children learning about medieval art in Spanish and doing hands-on activities, work. So for me, that was a very small thing that I thought about because I'm a linguist. I did my PhD in Hispanic linguistics. I always think about how does language permeate access? Every single event that I see in my neighborhood, I go in and I demand that the promotion be done bilingually, English and Spanish, because that says to people in my community, I am welcome in this space. So for me, it's what are the smallest things that we can do and we can think about to dismantle those barriers and give access to others, whether they live in the community or not, right? Right, Evelyn?
That is correct. I mean, and I think you both, hit the nail on the head. It is about communication, putting it out there to people that these spaces are accessible to them. My way, and it is in small ways. And I think that I've made it my life's work and passion to wherever I go, give people from the community access, but it also starts at home. I have children. So what I make sure is that I expose my children. I'm here in the Bronx near Washington Heights, right? But people don't know that, the cost to go into the Bronx Zoo, into a botanical garden is prohibitive. And they'll hide behind the fact that, oh, we have one day that is for free. Botanical garden doesn't even bother. We're members of those spaces so that we take our children there and tell them, here, this is your playground. We're in New York City, the capital of the world, and we make sure that we tell our children, we're not going anywhere. Una grúa me saca de aquí, porque, Frank Sinatra said it best. If you can't make it here, you can't make it anywhere. So I tell my children, go downtown. The way other people come here and own these spaces, you own New York City. This is your playground. With the membership that we have, we make sure that we take family members. My husband is a teacher in the South Bronx. When he takes those kids to the Bronx Zoo, he makes sure that they get access because it's not just the entrance, then they have fees for the exclusive activities. So if you don't have a membership and you don't have extra money on top of that, because you got to pay extra for these are cultural activities.
Right.
And these are beautiful spaces, and there are children from the South Bronx, there are children from New York City who've never stepped foot into these spaces until one of us. And it's like we all have been saying here, it's like our contribution is little by little, taking somebody, family members, friends, and acculturating them to these spaces. So I agree that it's un poquito.
And it's also, I think, before I give the floor to Nelson, it's also about re-educating your mindset that it's okay to be interested in art. It's okay to be interested in music of all kinds. It's okay to read certain books, and it's okay to aspire to become a well-rounded individual. Because also one thing that I find is that the reason why people self-segregate is because they envision the arts, music, literature to be something of de otra gente. Eso es para otro tipo de gente. Eso es para gente que priva en fina. And it shouldn't be that way. We should aspire to learn about these very worldly events and culture.
Yeah, and Luana,
Mhm.
I'm sorry, Liz. But the other thing that I make sure that I do is, like, my children, I've made sure that they've gone and study abroad. And for holidays, I buy them the ticket and they go away so that they can also become worldly and learn about other cultures. Because it's not just about, Dominican, New York, American, and westernized. They've all benefit from a liberal arts education that enriches them, and they've been able to study in spaces and institutions that they absorb all of that, but also travel and see what other people think. How do other people live in those spaces? Because there's a newfound appreciation when you come back and you see how other people live and what kind of relationship they have with their spaces.
These are great things, just again, as someone who has been in some of these spaces, etc. It sometimes sounds very easy, and it can be, but then there are times when even these experiences, going to travel elsewhere, if you don't look a certain way, you can be discriminated and or attacked, so these are also things to keep in mind. And I'm glad that we were able to discuss these matters and have these discussions here. And just real quickly on something that Luana also said, in terms of the culture, I wholeheartedly agree. We should, exchange, learn about other cultures, etc. And we also need to value our culture as well, because there are times when we're told, la bachata no sirve, bachata is garbage, and it's not. And there are people who might have seen over the years change their perspective, right? Because they grew up, oh, you couldn't listen to this because this type of music was for a certain type of people. And I'm proud to say that I come from family that listen to all this type of music, that listen to it. And, even elected officials understand the power, and they even use it during their campaigns, for example. But yes, I mean, this has been such an important conversation. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for, the feedback, and sort of not only just answering the questions, but also providing mediums for us to think about this and get this going. And I see the word. Please take us home.
So to conclude this conversation, este conversatorio, esta tertulia, right? In a very succinct couple of words, in a very succinct way, how do you see us connected with each other? How do you see the connection? ¿Cuál es, like, in conclusion, like 5, 10, 15, how do you see us staying connected? ¿Cuál será la conexión del siglo XXI? Bueno, estamos en el siglo XXI, pero how do we envision this connection? ¿Cómo visualizamos la conexión? Evelyn.
So I'll say, the internet technology has revolutionized, right? Because now, we have access. The world is at our fingertips, right? But the way I see it is that the technology, social media venues, but also I always say, starting at home. In my house, we'll dance to merengue, hip hop, bachata, salsa, whatever. We just dance to all kinds of beats. And through music and the internet, I think that those are two mediums that for me can bring us closer together. Historically, it has been successful. And I think that, I think music and the internet can help us connect.
I'm just amazed at how, 10, 15, 20 years ago, I had to buy a calling card to communicate with relatives in El Campo, right? Now today, fortunately, the vast majority of them, I can say, not everyone is in this position, but via WhatsApp, at any point of the day, I can just call them, send them a voice note or a text message. My parents, who would have thought that they would be texting, in their 70s, 60s, and they do it. And I'm able to share images of my wife and I, of our son with them. So, technology, we are there in the 21st century. We are communicating. We need to leverage it. We need to get better because not everyone has, equity, accessibility, inclusion, diversity. These are all important to me. These are all important to all of us. And we need to, make everything more equitable. And so we need to think about all these things, just everyone having the ability for it. But we are moving toward this. So we definitely need to move toward the technology. And if it means going, to the people that have the funds and create these programs, then that's where we need to go. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a little bit, I do agree with you, Evelyn. I'm a little bit more old fashioned because I remember when, I guess my answer is, I still believe in human connection. For me, I still believe in human connection. When I decided that I wanted to be a world traveler, and I have been traveling since like age 21. I also studied abroad, and then I backpacked through Europe, and then I went to Morocco, and then I've been to China and Japan and Buenos Aires. It's like, but I remember that the one person that did that to me when I was 9 years old was a 70-year-old woman named Doña Ana, who used to do Belgian lace. And she knew this craft, this beautiful craft of creating handmade lace. And she spoke about her trips. Because of her, I went to New Orleans because she spoke to me as a child. She would let me sneak into her house and I would talk to her at the age of 9 and look through her French magazines, her fashion magazines. And Doña Ana was my friend. And here we are, a 70-year-old woman who was spending that, and she was Dominican, Dominicana, que siempre vivió en la República Dominicana. And she was a very lonely old woman who was very good friends with my mom and very private also, but she allowed me in her home. And that's, she's probably wherever she is, a friend can be anyone. And this 70-year-old viejita who would talk to me about her trips, her travels, inspired me to be a world traveler. So I guess my idea is that we need to repair the human connection because, as Nelson says, we can gain access and design spaces and create equity if we get to know each other as people and know their plight, know their passion. So to me, it's going back to human connection, especially after COVID, after quarantine, after this pandemic. That's how I envision it.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, Nelson, like you said, we're going to have to learn how to leverage the technology and balance it, Luana. That's right. We can't forget the human element. I think this is a newfound space. I mean, look at us. We're here having esta conversación that's going to travel and it's going to be displayed in another space. And the technology has afforded us this opportunity. However, the human element, is definitely, especially after COVID, much needed. Absolutely. So we'll figure out how to balance, and I think that that's part of what, this whole conference is about, is balancing the ecosystem and how do we interconnect in the kind of relationship that we have with each other. I mean, I think this is going to be a newfound relationship with this space and technology, So I think that we'll have to figure out how to balance that because the ecosystem is about, how do we balance it so that we're all in harmony.
Harmony, armonía. Well, I want to thank you both for this conversation. And I also want to thank La Biennale de Venezia, focusing on conexiones. And thank you so much.
Sí, muchísimas gracias y un placer haber tenido esta conversación con Luana y Nelson, mis colegas.